On July 2nd, 2013, inside a recording studio in Nashville, Tennessee, two old friends sat across from each other with a single microphone between them. Kenny Rogers was 74 years old. Dolly Parton was 67. They had known each other for 3 decades, sung together on stages from Vegas to London, and built one of the most beloved partnerships in the history of country music. That afternoon, they were there to record a song called You Can't Make Old Friends. Neither of them fully understood, walking in, just how heavy that title would feel by the time they walked out. This is the real story of that day, and the story of everything that led up to it. Kenny Rogers and Dolly Parton first crossed paths in the late 1970s, when both of them were becoming two of the biggest names in country music. Kenny had just broken through with Lucille and The Gambler. Dolly was already a star from her years with Porter Wagoner and was stepping into her own solo spotlight. They ran in the same circles, played the same award shows, and shared the same manager for a stretch of their careers. But it wasn't until 1983 that the two of them actually sat down to record something together. That song was Islands in the Stream, written by the Bee Gees, Barry, Robin, and Maurice Gibb. Originally intended as a solo track before someone suggested it needed 2 voices instead of 1. Kenny and Dolly recorded it that year, and within 7 weeks it hit #1 on the Billboard Hot 100, knocking Bonnie Tyler's Total Eclipse of the Heart out of the top spot. At the same time, it topped both the country and adult contemporary charts, making Kenny and Dolly the first country duo to hold all 3 chart positions simultaneously since Glen Campbell in 1968. The song sold 2 million copies by that Christmas alone, and decades later, in 2023, the RIA certified it triple platinum, with more than 3 million units sold. It was the kind of hit that could have made either of them wary of ever singing together again. How do you follow a song that big? But instead, it became the seed of a friendship that would stretch across the rest of both their lives. What's striking, looking back at their entire partnership, is how rarely they actually recorded together. Over 30 years of friendship, tours, and television appearances, Kenny and Dolly only ever released 5 official duets. Islands in the Stream came first in 1983. Then came Love is Strange, Real Love, and Christmas Without You. And finally, in 2013, You Can't Make Old Friends, the song that would turn out to be their last. Kenny used to joke that their batting average was better than baseball legend Ted Williams. 5 swings, 3 #1 country hits, 1 genuine pop phenomenon, and a Grammy nomination along the way. He wasn't exaggerating by much. Fans, for years, wanted more from them than friendship. There was a persistent hope, sometimes voiced outright by audiences at their joint concerts, that Kenny and Dolly might be something more than close friends. Dolly herself fed the legend a little, once saying that Kenny was the only man she'd ever seen who could make white hair look sexy. But both of them were consistent, publicly and privately, that the relationship never crossed into romance. Dolly described him in interviews as being like a big brother to her. Kenny said much the same about her. On tour, crew members and venue managers would sometimes joke about it, placing friendly bets on which city's audience would finally get the on-stage kiss they were all waiting for. It never came, because that was never what the friendship was. What made it work, according to people who spent time around them, was exactly that restraint. They flirted on stage because it was fun and because the audience loved it, but backstage there was something closer to family. 2 people from working-class Southern childhoods who had clawed their way to the top of an industry that chews people up and who recognized something of themselves in each other. By the time 2013 rolled around, Kenny was 74 years old and had already lived several careers inside one lifetime. Teenage doo-wop singer, jazz bassist, psychedelic rock frontman with the First Edition, television host, country balladeer, and finally, elder statesman of the genre. Dolly, at 67, was still one of the most active performers in American music, juggling recording, acting, and her ownership of the Dollywood theme park. Both of them had slowed down from the pace of their younger years, but neither had stopped. The song that brought them back into a studio together, You Can't Make Old Friends, was written by Don Schlitz and Caitlin Smith. Schlitz was no stranger to Kenny. He was the same songwriter behind The Gambler, the song that had defined Kenny's career back in 1978. There was something fitting about that connection. The man who wrote the song that made Kenny Rogers a legend was, 35 years later, writing the song that would close out his recording career with Dolly. The lyrics of You Can't Make Old Friends are built around a simple, aching idea. No matter how much money you have, no matter how many people you meet in a lifetime, you cannot manufacture history with someone. Old friends are earned through decades, not purchased or replaced. The song imagines two people near the end of their lives, wondering aloud what they'll do when the other one is gone. When Kenny and Dolly walked into the studio that July afternoon in 2013, they weren't trying to make a statement about mortality. They were doing what they'd always done, showing up to sing a good song with someone they trusted. But almost immediately, the weight of the lyrics started to catch up with both of them. According to people present at the session, the mood in the room shifted the moment they reached the song's key line. What will I do when you are gone? Who's gonna finish this song? It's a lyric that, on paper, reads as simple songwriting craft, a clever bit of wordplay tying the idea of friendship to the idea of the song itself. But sung by two 70-something performers who had genuinely spent 30 years of their lives in and out of each other's orbit, it stopped being clever. It became real. The studio engineer on the session later described the room going quiet in a way that studio rooms rarely do. People in the control booth, used to the routine of takes and retakes, found themselves wiping their eyes before the first verse had even finished. It wasn't a performance of sadness. It was two people who had built a life around music suddenly hearing their own future spoken back to them in four-part harmony. Kenny, according to those who worked with him that day, had to stop the take more than once. Not because his voice cracked in a way that ruined the recording. His voice, weathered by decades of touring, actually suited the song's aging narrator perfectly. But because the emotion of it caught him off guard. He needed a moment. He'd take a breath, collect himself, and go again. Dolly, for her part, held it together in the way she always seemed to on record. But those close to her said the song stayed with her long after the session ended. They finished it. That's the important part. Despite how heavy the room got, despite the pauses, despite two old friends staring down the exact thing the lyrics were describing, they got the take they needed. You Can't Make Old Friends was released as a single and became the title track of Kenny's 2013 album of the same name. Commercially, it wasn't a blockbuster. It reached only number 57 on the country charts, a modest showing compared to the chart-topping highs of Islands in the stream 30 years earlier. But chart position was never really the point of that song, and audiences seemed to understand that instinctively. The music video, which showed Kenny and Dolly performing together intercut with imagery reflecting on their decades of friendship, reached 1 million views within 10 days of release, a remarkable number for two artists whose core fan base skewed well into their 50s and beyond. It wasn't a song people streamed casually in the background. It was a song people sought out because they knew what it was. Looking back, You Can't Make Old Friends carries a weight that neither Kenny, Dolly, nor the songwriters could have fully planned for. It became, in every meaningful sense, their goodbye, not because either of them knew it at the time, but because life arranged it that way. In April 2018, Kenny Rogers began what was billed as the Gambler's Last Deal, his farewell tour. It was meant to take him across 5 continents and roughly 200 shows over several years, closing out a touring career that had started back in the late 1950s with a band of Houston teenagers calling themselves the Scholars. Kenny had hoped, as part of that farewell run, to share the stage with Dolly one final time, a proper send-off duet performed live, in front of an audience, the way Islands in the Stream had first captivated the world 35 years earlier. It didn't happen. In the final stretch of that tour, at 79 years old, Kenny experienced a dizzy spell on stage. Doctors told him plainly that his body could no longer keep up with the demands of touring. He listened. The final 8 shows of the farewell tour were cancelled, including planned appearances in North Carolina and London. The Stagecoach Festival had to remove his name from its lineup posters. For the first time in 6 decades of performing, Kenny didn't finish a tour he'd started. His final live show count stopped at 53 performances, a number he had been tracking meticulously in a leather notebook since 1957, the same year he'd recorded his very first single, That Crazy Feeling, as a 19-year-old in Houston. The reunion duet with Dolly that fans had hoped for, the one Kenny himself had hoped for, never came together. In that sense, the studio session from 2013, the one where his voice cracked on the line about finishing the song, ended up being exactly what it felt like in the room that day. It was the last time Kenny Rogers and Dolly Parton would ever record together. Kenny Rogers died on March 20th, 2020, at his home in Sandy Springs, Georgia. He was 81. His wife Wanda was with him, along with the twin sons he'd had late in life and his 3 older children. Because of the COVID-19 pandemic just beginning to take hold across the country, there could be no large public funeral. Instead, landmarks across the country turned off their lights in tribute. The Grand Ole Opry went dark, as did the Astrodome in Houston, the stadium not far from the housing project where Kenny had grown up as one of 8 children sharing a 2-room apartment. In Las Vegas, the lyrics to his song Lady were projected across the neon skyline. 1 week after his death, a previously unreleased song called Goodbye surfaced. It had been written by Lionel Richie back in 1981 and quietly recorded by Kenny in 2009, then shelved. Richie later explained that he wrote it after watching Kenny perform backstage, sensing even then that the song would eventually find its moment. It finally did, released on March 27, 2020. The lyrics open with the line, "No more kisses, no more I love yous," and much like You Can't Make Old Friends 7 years earlier, it read, in hindsight, like a message written for exactly this occasion, even though nobody intended it that way at the time. Dolly Parton, for her part, has spoken since Kenny's passing about how much that friendship meant to her, describing him as family, not just a musical partner. The 5 songs they made together remain a small but towering body of work. 5 recordings across 30 years that somehow produced 3 country #1s, a genuine pop culture phenomenon in Islands in the Stream, a Grammy nomination, and finally, a quiet, aching farewell that neither of them planned to be a farewell when they walked into that Nashville studio in the summer of 2013. There's a certain honesty in how their partnership actually played out, especially compared to the myths that tend to grow up around famous friendships. There was no secret hospital session, no smuggled equipment, no dramatic last-minute reunion at the edge of death. The truth was quieter, and in its own way, sadder. 2 friends who ran out of time to say a proper goodbye on stage, and a song from years earlier that ended up saying it for them. Kenny Rogers spent his career telling stories about gamblers, drifters, and people who knew when to hold on and when to let go. In the end, his own story followed that same shape. He held on to his friendship with Dolly Parton for over 30 years, through 5 recordings, countless television appearances, and a shared understanding that never needed to become anything more than what it already was. And when the moment came to let go, not in a hospital room with hidden microphones, but in an ordinary Nashville studio on an ordinary July afternoon, the song they happened to be recording turned out to be about exactly that. What will I do when you are gone? Who's gonna finish this song? It wasn't written as an epitaph, but that's what it became, for both of them, and for everyone who has listened to it since.